there's that great letter that I quote in the book from Henry, aged about 15, writing back to his father. Burned his house down. Lots of love. Hope all's well. Please send money. Henry.
Arthur is he's a mashup, and he always has been. It's part of the Arthurian tradition, really, to take what you like and sweep the rest under the rug.
I'm Dan Jones. I'm the author of, most recently, Henry V, a biography of England's greatest warrior king. Henry V is my 15th book, unbelievably, mostly non-fiction, mostly medieval, but some fiction have crept in there as well. And some viewers may have seen my show, Secrets of Great British Castles, and I make a podcast, This is History. There are other deeds and achievements, but those are the headlines. And it's my pleasure to be talking to Lev Grossman, whose book, The Bright Sword, I have here with me. I've got mine as well. Why not show them both off? Lev, it's a real pleasure to be talking to you. So you tell us about yourself as well.
Well, I was the longtime book critic for Time magazine. Then, like you, turned to less reputable pursuits and novels, the Magicians books, which were turned into a long-running TV show. And yes, most recently, The Bright Sword, which is a retelling of the Arthur legend. My first question to you has to do with the opening, the way you choose to open your book about Henry V, which is this extraordinary scene of Henry taking one in the face with an arrow at a battle, the name of which I already forget. Why did you choose that moment in his eventful life to start the story?
Well, yeah, this is the moment. The Battle of Shrewsbury in 1403, 21st of July, 1403, is when Henry's 16 years old, and he fights in the first of only two battles that he'll ever fight. I mean, he's best known through Shakespeare for the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, but 1403, when he's a teenager, he has this he commands the rear guard in his father's army to defend the Lancastrian crown against rebels led by Hotspur, Henry Percy. And in that battle, he's terribly injured and then has to go through a long operation to save his life. And I think, I mean, and this really forms the hinge of the biographical conceit in Henry V. He comes out of this operation seemingly forged, changed, formed. He operates certainly from this point onwards as though he believes God has saved him for a reason. And as you know very well, like, opening scenes are really important. And I took a lot of my cues when I was developing my craft as a nonfiction writer from screenwriting. I always believed that those first 5 minutes of the movie, as it were, should have all the ingredients of the movie in them. I've been listening to The Bright Sword on audiobook, and the first scene of your book is a fight as well, and a young man having a fight, his life in peril, and seems to sort of set up so many of the themes ahead. And I was thinking, as I listened to that bit of the book, that there were some overlaps here, and that we were always trying, whether it's fiction or whether it's non-fiction, to show the path ahead in some ways in these early scenes. I mean, how did you use this scene to get into the Arthurian story that you unfold?
Well, like I said, you want to have, in some sense, the whole rest of the story compressed into that one opening moment.
Right.
That particular case, this is a kid who's been training his whole life to fight. He's been raised on stories about King Arthur. He's having his first collision between the fiction that he's developed in his mind about what life as a British knight would be, and the reality of it. And those moments where fiction and reality collide have always been of, of huge interest to me. And of course, things don't go precisely the way that he'd hoped. It's a good time to be writing Arthurian fiction because we know a lot more now than we did even a couple of decades ago about how knights actually fought.
Mm.
There's been absolutely heroic work done by the hobbyists, really, the historical European martial arts enthusiasts, figuring out exactly how knights fought based on these highly confusing, elusive handbooks of sword fighting. And so, in that first scene, I realized that anywhere you can steal a march on T.H. White or someone like that, Marion Zimmer Bradley, I take that opportunity, and I knew that I knew much more about how knights fought than those people did, and I wanted to flex a little bit of that knowledge as quickly as I could.
It's a long time since anyone's taken on the Arthurian legends in the way that you seem to be doing here, at scale, a full kind of reinvention, a kind of, a generational take on these stories, if you like. And I found that fascinating because, of course, the joy of the Arthurian legends in some ways. I remember George R. R. Martin saying, and I know he's quoted, giving great praise to your book on the cover. But I remember interviewing George 5-6 years ago, and he said there are two types of writer. There's the architect and the gardener. And I remember hearing that and being quite, he said he was a gardener, and I at that time considered myself an architect. I was writing nonfiction at that time, which is for me a very architectural, clear, blocked out process in which you know where you're going almost entirely when you begin. It sounds like when you're writing fiction, it is a process of discovery in that case.
There is a process of discovery. I believe about myself that I know it all in advance. I am inevitably mistaken that when I come to the end of having written the story, it's about something entirely different from what I thought it was, and then I have to start all over again. And this will occur 6 or 7 times during the course of the writing. So I start out with wonderful confidence, and I realized that I was an idiot. And slowly, and this book took me 10 years to write. I very slowly figure out what it actually is about. And for me, there's never been any way to there's never been any shortcut around that process, and I don't know why that is, except that I wish that I were cleverer. But with someone like Henry V,
Yeah.
obviously a well-known historical personage,
Mm.
you must have had, when you began, a strong sense of who you felt that he was. Did your sense of him change over the course of writing this book?
I knew in one sense when I started writing about Henry V that I wanted to. I'd read a lot of biographies, all of which concentrated on his reign, which is 9 years out of a 35-year life. And I'd come from writing 2 novels back to back, and then I was going back to nonfiction. And I'd really sort of thought quite hard. I'd never written a biography before, so I was thinking in much more sort of character-driven biographical terms. And I was very convinced that to write an interesting biography of Henry V for me, and now, I wanted to go back to the shape of Henry V as you see him in Shakespeare, in which you really have across the 3 plays, Henry IV, Part 1, 2, and then Henry V. You see the life in the round. Now, it's not in Shakespeare a totally accurate life in the round, because Shakespeare's Prince Hal is not an accurate rendering of the real young Henry V, but the proportions are right. And I felt like it would be very hard to understand the historical Henry V, this hard-nosed, unbelievably driven, quite cold in many ways, high achieving, and so on and so forth. I felt it would be very hard to understand this man if we hadn't spent a lot of time with him in the 26 years before he became king. So I knew the structure, and I don't think the structure changed very much in the writing. But my central assumption about Henry was that he'd grown up as a child under Richard II, who is in so many ways the photographic negative of Henry V, whereas Henry is all business, action, a doing king. Richard II is sort of inaction, a being king. He's just into the job of kingship and expects everyone else to fall in with him and never to actually have to work for anything. And I thought that I would see Henry as just simply reacting against everything he'd seen as a child and doing the opposite. And it was much more. As I worked on the biography, I realized that it's a much more complex story than that. So I think even within nonfiction, and the process you're describing about writing fiction, thinking you know what the book's about and discovering it is different as you write. I that for me is the experience of writing fiction. But I hadn't had it quite so profoundly in nonfiction before, of thinking I knew where I was going, and then finding out along the way that I was probably quite wrong about that.
I feel like Henry V is I mean, Richard II, not a top five kings of all time,
Oh,
amazing king. But as a character, much easier to get into what's going on with him, just because he seems like he wasn't that self-aware. He wasn't self-controlled in the way that Henry V was. I feel as though Henry V is such a tough nut to crack, because he was so in control
Mm.
of himself, of the way others perceived him. Um, and it, I'm curious how you find your way into a guy like that, whose public image is so polished, and who's so he's managing every detail. He doesn't slip up in that way that is revealing, that you want characters to slip up.
No, and you're right. And I think that Richard II is this fascinating character, and a brilliant character, and just a gimme, really, because he is such a screwed up, like car wreck of a king. And so it's great material. And Henry, you're right, is very different. He is so controlled. He's so buttoned up. He's so sort of all business and focused. And it's looking for little tiny sort of pinpricks within the mask, within the where the light comes in, and the detail that got me thinking about him in a new way came quite early on. And I was looking through records of his childhood, and found this reference to the clothes he was bought as a little boy. In the first chapter of the book, it's called "The Boy in the Black Straw Hat," and it's a kind of innocuous record, really. You just see an account in his family's payments going out to suppliers for a black straw hat for summer to keep the sun off his face. But there was something in that image that really humanized
Mm.
by some people's estimation, um, warmonger, warlord. Many people, many historians, particularly in recent years, have found Henry hard to love, hard to like, hard to get into. They just found him sort of callous, cold, cruel, misogynistic, and a warmonger. But I think that when you start to just find it's the clothes as a child. It's the new suits that he and his brothers have bought before they go to Richard II's revenge parliament, or the party the night before. And then when he's an adult, it comes through music. It's
Mm.
references to harp strings that he's buying, and the
He's
musical
always
instrument he's
sending out
taking
for
care
new
of.
harp strings.
Always with the harp strings, but also the reading. And when he goes on campaign, he's always taking a stack of books with him. And
Mm.
towards the end of his life, it's books about crusading, because he's reading all the chronicles of the First Crusade, but he's really into Arthurian history as well. And so it's fascinating that these stories, the ancient stories, the matter of Britain, were as intriguing to Henry V as they are to the audience today. I was interested in an interview I read with you, talking about how you create King Arthur in The Bright Sword, and I think you said that originally you wanted him to be a kind of doofus, a slob, a kind of screw up type king, and then found that was really hard to put on a hero like King Arthur. I wonder if you could say a bit more about that.
Sure. Much like Henry V, King Arthur he's a difficult character to draw, as it turns out, because partly because he's so good. Incredibly good people often tend to be not that interesting. This is a guy who understands what God wants of him, and he's gonna do it. He also doesn't have. There's a broad swath in the middle of his story where he doesn't do very much. He pulls
Mm.
a sword out of the stone, gets the sword from Lady of the Lake, starts the round table, and then he sits back, and the other knights go out and do their adventures. And Arthur, he doesn't. He's a king. He's not a knight. He sits at the table. He listens to what everybody has to say. Even when the Holy Grail turns up, Arthur does not go in search of it. He just sends everybody else out. He doesn't get a lot of long monologues. Possibly one reason why Shakespeare never wrote a King Arthur play. You don't really know what's going on in his head. And is there a conflict happening within him that is keeping him so still? It's very difficult to know. And then the very end of the story, he sort of wakes up just in time for he and Mordred to kill each other, and that's it. So it's quite difficult to penetrate into the interior of this guy who's giving you very little to work with. Again, I think because he's quite self-controlled, but he definitely had to be good. I tried writing a version of Arthur where he was a jerk, and strangely, he somehow ceased to be Arthur. It turns out, I think, that his defining characteristic is that he wants to be perfect. He wants to be better than he wants to live up to this ideal of Christian chivalry that has been laid out for him. And of course, he fails because that ideal is beyond human attainment. And I suppose that's where you learn the most about him, is when he fails. To go back to Henry for a second, and his coldness, there's some extraordinary stuff that goes down in his life. Starting really from that, I thought this was the other part where you could start the story. That moment, bunch of Welshmen, they've rebelled. They're stuck in their castle, Conwy or something like that. And Henry's on the scene, and as he's the sort of senior aristocrat present. So when they take these 9 prisoners, he has to decide what's going to be done with them, and he has them put to death, and not just put to death, but they get the full English. That they're beheaded, they're drawn. I don't know what else, quartered, whatever else that they did to people. My daughter is 14. I think she would have had a hard time giving that order. But Henry, who's 14, he makes the call, and it's far from the last such call that he will make. I mean, Siege of Rouen, it's like you don't want to compare things to a concentration camp, but terrible things go down there where people are starving, just outside the walls, and Henry won't let them out. Was he a bad person?
This is the main criticism that historians have leveled against him recently. But I think that you don't have to spend too much time in the Middle Ages to feel that about almost anyone. And the standards of political and military engagement are just wildly different than anything that we know today. I think Henry as a teenager is a fascinating case, and teens, the threshold for what we would consider not just adult responsibility, but the very upper echelons of adult responsibility, that is, the wielding the power of life and death, which today we in the West devolve really only to our very, very highest politicians, falls on what we would now consider teenagers relatively regularly in the Middle Ages, as you know. But I think that some people like it more than others. A Richard II, for example, never really has much of a taste for the sort of military decision making that Henry seems to like. I mean, Richard is happy to kind of order his uncles murdered and such, but he's blanches at the idea of going to war and the nastiness that will typically involve. There's that great letter that I quote in the book from Henry, aged about 15, writing back to his father, reporting on his campaigns against the Welsh rebel Owain Glyndŵr, where he says, Glyndŵr's been putting it around that he wants a fight. Well, I decided I'd take him up on it, but I went looking for him. He was nowhere to be seen. So I went around his house, but he wasn't in. So I burned his house down. Then I went around his other house, but he wasn't there. So I cut his best mate's head off. Lots of love. Hope all's well. Please send money. Henry, and you see this, and there's this just such a sort of joy and a love for fighting that's there right from the beginning. And then when you get to the Siege of Rouen, for example, where there are people starving in the ditch, Henry will often devolve responsibility for these sort of things. And when the Rouennais are about to give up in 1419 and say, look, we've had enough, you've besieged us for 6 months, it's time to we surrender the city. And they ask him, would the first thing you do be to offer some succor to the poor people who are starving to death between the lines in the ditch? They are having a terrible time. He just says, who put them there? You drove them out of the city. And so he is capable of this extraordinary harshness. And again, I mean, most famously, ordering the death of the prisoners at Agincourt. But curiously, the contemporary comment is never unnecessarily harsh, a tyrant, anything. If anything, he's set up as a paragon of sort of fairness. He tells you what he's going to do, and he does it. And he's never unpredictable. He is a sort of harsh master, but not seen as a sort of terrible or excessive master. He always operates within bounds of acceptable behavior. But
there's always somebody around who makes him look good by comparison. I felt like if casting about for a subject for a future book, John the Fearless almost steals the spotlight here and there, including with his fantastic death.
Because I was going to ask you a question about sources and which versions of Arthur you go back to, which tellings you kind of draw on most, whether it's Mallory or you go all the way back to Chrétien de Troyes and Eschenbach and so on. But I suppose that there's a slightly broader question that's on my mind as well. Again, and I have George R. R. Martin sort of in a little corner here somewhere, which is how much do you sort of range throughout the Middle Ages, just magpieing the most terrible or striking or gory or compelling bits. I mean, are you a sort of roamer around history in that sense?
I also have a little George R. R. Martin. It's never far away.
No,
he's
everywhere all the time.
Yeah. I mean, it makes me cringe to think of a proper historian reading The Bright Sword, because Arthur is he's a mashup. And he always has been. I mean, it's really part of the Arthurian tradition, really, to take what you like and sweep the rest under the rug. So I'm always constantly roaming through lengthy histories in search of that one detail, like the black straw hat, that one detail that will put you there. I think there's a moment in The Distant Mirror. Barbara Tuchman, and she just mentions a church with its rose window broken and the rain gusting in and falling on the altar. Or there's another. Actually, this is quite close to the black straw hat. Ewart Oakeshott, historian of knightly arms and armor. He has a throwaway remark where he says, "Oh, and it was common for knights to grow their hair shoulder length so that they can pin it up under their helmet as additional padding." And when I read that, what I immediately thought was, what I immediately saw was a knight at the end of the day removing his helm and unpinning his hair and then letting it fall down. And when that knight did that, I was in the room with him. That image of a knight letting down his hair after a hard day of battle. I don't know whether knights really did grow their hair that long. We had a saying at Time magazine: sometimes there's a fact that's too good to check, and I didn't go looking for any further confirmation that knights had long hair, just because it absolutely sell you the person in that one detail.
But that's fascinating, isn't it? And when I have made my diversions from history into historical fiction, well, the first thing to say is that I hope never that historian reading historical fiction and going, "Oh gosh, no," and sort of underlining errors. I think that is to misunderstand fundamentally the point of doing historical fiction, right? But I think that there are these moments where it's sometimes easier in historical fiction to approach a human truth from the past than it necessarily can be in writing nonfiction. I mean, my fiction is set in the 100 Years' War among a group of ordinary guys, and the grunts, for want of a better term, in the 100 Years' War, not pursuing chivalric ideals, in fact, constantly being stitched up by the knights who think this is all a big chivalrous game. And I love going back into that world and playing around with the sources. And I remember reading an account of it's earlier in the Hundred Years' War than Henry V, but it's an account of one of Edward III's campaigns on the Crécy campaign, where John Froissart, the great chronicler of the noble pursuit of war in the 14th to 15th centuries, talks about the English going to a city, it's either Valognes or Caen, somewhere like that, and they're there for 48 hours, 72 hours, and Froissart just says the city was taken. Well, well, I think we
Yeah.
know what that involves typically in a war where there's a chevauchée and it's war of terror. So I don't know. I mean, do you agree that you can get somehow closer to human truth sometimes, even if you're in the realm of fantasy, even if you are in the realm of mashing up? I mean, and this is for me, I suppose, why Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine and Richard the Lionheart and Edward I and Edward III and Henry V, they all loved Arthur because there's
Yeah.
obviously something in these stories that's speaking to their experience as well, even as the story is fantastic.
Yes. Uh, it's true. I mean, it's both. uh, Sometimes I had a very hard time feeling as though I could get into the human truth of these experiences that people had in
Mm,
the Middle Ages, which are so um, uh, distant from our own. But I think it was the it was the great achievement of the really of the French of Chrétien and people like that to endow these knights with proper inner lives. I feel as though up to that point, Geoffrey of Monmouth, these are basically sort of Dark Ages warlords, going about their business. And then suddenly, when it passes over to France, these knights are endowed with love lives, these romantic yearnings that they have, and also this very intense spiritual life. Suddenly,
mm,
Arthur becomes very Christian, and this idea of the pursuit of the Grail becomes very essential to who they are. That was the moment I felt as though they gained these inner lives. And often, what I struggled with was finding those details, which I often find they are not of primary interest to historians. Those tiny details
mm,
that give you a sense of what it's like to be in the room. Um, uh, I read somewhere, again, in fact, too good to check, that before pillows became common possessions that people would have in all levels of society, people often slept with a log under their head. They would just have a stick of wood, which they would rest their head on to, I guess, keep it at an appropriate angle. And I found that so, so astounding. I'd been desperate for some sense of what happened when you went to bed, when it was I don't know, the 12th century, or I would take the 6th century as well. And as it turns out, you pull out your favorite log and you get your head down on it. Um, I was always desperate for details like that. Um, uh, um, Stuff about the world of the Dark Ages, because of course Arthur belongs to the 6th century, basically, even though we give him a lot of medieval trappings, and the reality of the fact that they were living in basically a post-apocalyptic world, in the ruins of everything the Romans built, and using their pottery, which they couldn't make really anymore as well, and so Roman pottery was very prized. It would break, they would wire it back together with iron wire. Another great detail that I picked up from somebody or other. They couldn't mint coins anymore, so the coins are getting rubbed smoother and smoother because they
mm.
circulate long after they would ordinarily have been taken out of circulation. I was so hungry for these just homely little details that would allow you to sell the character in a way that, as a historian, I presume, what doesn't really have to do. And especially with the lower classes, the grunts, as you say, I found it very difficult to dig up information, get good sources about what their lives were like. I'm curious as to actually what sources you relied on when you did what you rely on when you write your fiction?
I it's about it's the opposite of writing the sort of the big historical narratives. I find that writing the big historical narratives, you're often, winnowing away, getting that's not important, that's not important, trying to get just the essential blocks of these big stories. Um, Whereas with fiction, it's about mining for as you say, the tiniest little details, which which will then become the big story. I think it was Bernard Cornwell I remember talking to, who said you've got the big story and the little story, and in history you're always really focused on the big story, and the little story, the tiny details, they just sort of hang as the decoration, really, the little sort of
Mm,
decorations on the Christmas tree. But when you're in the realm of fiction, it's all flipped on its head, and the little story is everything. And um, I try, when I'm doing a book like Henry V, to strike a balance, so that these arcane details and the funny little sort of um, that I don't discard all of the incidental detail. I don't discard all of the humanizing stuff. And sometimes that means that structuring a chapter, yes, probably on the chapter level in nonfiction, it's like an accordion. You're going from very, very small detail, and then uh, the granular detail of an anecdote or a scene, so that you really put the reader in the place and in the time, and lots of techniques borrowed from fiction while sticking to the historical fact. And then you kind of change lens as well. I've been an accordion, now I'm a film camera, but you change lens, and then you've got the big story, and you can kind of sweep a little bit, and move the story faster, and then you come back down to a detailed little scene. And so I find that nonfiction often works better like that, where I'm trying to have that tight human detail that one would normally associate with writing fiction, whilst also the grand sweep of nonfiction. I did it in a book called Powers and Thrones, which was a long book. It was 250, 260,000 words, I think, something like that. But it covered 1100 years of a history of the whole Middle Ages. So to
mm.
try and strike the balance between the grand sweep of history, but also have these really sort of tight anecdotes, that's the challenge. But that's why I like writing nonfiction. Although, having said that, I'm writing a novel at the moment, so have
I'm
it both
glad to hear
ways.
you say that about the word count. People complain that The Bright Sword is incredibly long, and it is an incredibly thick book. It's only 195,000 words. I feel as though
People,
George, he blows by 195,000, two-thirds of the way through, and
you
just keeps going.
just keep going. Just keep going. That's all we can do.
I have a last question for you about
Yeah,
Henry V.
please. Come on.
It involves a strained analogy with King Arthur. Um, uh, King Arthur, the real downfall of the Round Table was the quest for the Holy Grail, which
Mm.
was seemed like a good idea at the time, but was disastrous. And it ended with sort of God abandoning Britain, and half the table is dead. It was the beginning of the end for Arthur. Um, and I guess my question is conquest of France. There's any number of moments in Henry V where I think it is truly incredible that Britain does not own France, because the English were doing so well. They were doing so well, and they couldn't finish it off. Was there ever a scenario where Henry's ambition was realized? His story gets sort of cut off halfway through. Had he lived, is there any way he could have completed the conquest of France in that way that he dreamed of, or was it a grail that could never be attained?
I think it was a grail that could never be attained, but I think he also knew that. I think that had he lived even 2 or 3 more years, it it would have been settled. I mean, there was a settlement still to be made with the Dauphin. Yes, the Treaty of Troyes had effectively partitioned France and given the northern half to Henry and the Burgundians, disinherited the Dauphin. He's down in the south, the Kingdom of Bourges. Henry's mind, as I tried to suggest in the book, was turning towards Jerusalem.
Mm.
He was not only reading histories of the Crusades, he had someone out mapping the coast of and the territory of the Holy Lands. Um, the Papal Schism had been settled, I think his mind was turning to Jerusalem, and I think there would have been a deal, a revised deal, had he lived another 2 or 3 years, that would have probably brought the wars to some sort of a sustainable conclusion with the Dauphin. The problem was he died so suddenly in the midst of everything, and leaving only a son who was 1 year old, and then nobody could renegotiate until his son became 18. So you have 17 years in which it's impossible to renegotiate terms because only the king can do that. And so what then happens 30 years later is you have the Wars of the Roses in England, and this seems to have been this is only half a Grail pun, a poisoned chalice. Uh, I think not impossible, but then again, all of this assumes that the 100 Years' War is over, and there are some of us here who still believe that there's an outside chance that that this thing this thing still has years to run, and that maybe, just maybe, the final outcome of Brexit will be a reverse hostile takeover of France by the Brits. But that's the future, and my realm is the past.
Right. Yes. Okay. Now that I've asked you that thorny hypothetical question, I can let you go.
Well, listen, Lev, it's an absolute pleasure talking to you from literally from the other side of the world. Congratulations on the Bright Sword. It's wonderful.
Well,
it's a wonderful achievement, and it really brings the the Middle Ages alive in a way that's that for me is absolutely delightful. So thank you for writing it.
Well, that's the goal. That's the goal.
It's been a pleasure.